Hello students, I'm Mr. Phillips.
And I'm Mr. Davila.
And this is our introductory PowerPoint, Government 101. We're going to go through some political philosophers who influenced the foundations of our government, as well as look at different types of government and systems of government. So this will serve as your introduction for Unit 1 and cover a lot of material for Unit 1, so we hope you enjoy it.
So around the 17th and 18th century, we start to see that thinkers within Europe and just the general populace started to question the pre-existing governing structures that existed, most of which were absolute monarchies. You had kings or emperors or queens that had absolute power and really no check on their powers. And there was an emerging merchant class, a middle class, that really began to question the wisdom behind just surrendering their decision-making power to these, so-called enlightened and or divinely chosen rulers, especially when they were seeing, in reality, they were making some pretty poor decisions. And so this gave rise to the Enlightenment age and thinkers on a variety of topics. There was, thinkers and philosophers that were challenging norms or ideas that had existed before. But we're going to focus our attention on the political realm and how people were rethinking how government should be arranged and structured to best serve the people. So some key questions that the philosophers debated were, or are in this case, is government necessary? And this is a natural starting point when you're trying to sort of answer the question of what kind of government may be best suited for our purposes. It makes sense to start, well, is government itself even necessary? And the next question you'll see here, if it is necessary, then what type of government is the best? And so this question obviously sort of makes quite clear that the answer to the first question would be yes. And during, regular school years, we would play a state of nature game where students would get together in groups and we would allow them to interact with each other, but with very few rules governing them. And almost always you saw that the groups were quite destructive. In other words, most people ended up enslaved or dead. And this was a pretty powerful exercise for students to witness themselves, is to see what happens when there are no authorities or governing rules or anyone who can enforce rules. Things get or go awry pretty fast. And so the next question is then, okay, if we need government, what type of government is the best kind of government? And along with that, you need to answer the following question, which is, what is the proper relationship between the government and the people? So in order to answer that second question, you have to get at this last question. And this is really at the core of the investigation, examination, and the thinking that the philosophers engage in that we'll be discussing here in the next several slides. So, as I mentioned, we played the state of nature game, and the reason why you have this as a starting point is because, again, the philosophers wanted to think about what life may have been like in this so-called state of nature. And the notion of the state of nature is simply a state of being where human beings don't have any governing structure or authority at all. And so this is, in other words, where the human species was prior to civilization, perhaps, or formal civilization. So there were these loose associational groups of people. So they may have had some connection, but there was really no organized interaction or collaboration necessarily. So this then gets at, well, okay, how did people behave when there was no government? And is this something that's sustainable?
Right. So we could use an analogy, like a sports analogy. So whether it's football or soccer or any sport you want to pick, think of like the referee as the government. Well, if you didn't have that referee, what would happen in that game? So if it's a high stakes game, you're playing in the state championship soccer game, and you had no referees, it would be sort of a free-for-all, right? So then you'd have a situation where some players might follow the rules and try to follow the normal rules of soccer, let's say, that they know. But what if a few people don't follow the rules, and then suddenly, some people start doing illegal tackles or dangerous maneuvers on the field, pushing other players down, and then even the players who followed the rules or tried to follow the rules might then revert to that type of play because they would want, they would see that other team gaining an advantage. So in order to survive and win, they would then sort of resort to those tactics. So ultimately, what all of these philosophers agree upon is that the state of nature is not sustainable. Having no government or civil authority over the long run is not sustainable. And sometimes I use the example of, people would turn into this type of person you'd see in a movie like The Purge. If I don't know if you've seen that movie, but basically I think, the concept of a free-for-all where no law exists for one night in this future, dystopian society. And, things turn very, very bad for many people, and many people revert to their animal instincts and begin harming and killing and stealing from others.
So one last thing I just want to make sure that we're clear about is that the state of nature, we're going to find out that philosophers sort of characterize the state of nature in different ways, but they come to a similar conclusion. And we're going to see some of that here in the next couple slides. All right, so we start with Thomas Hobbes, right? So Thomas Hobbes lived in England, and he actually lived during a period of time that was quite tumultuous. In other words, there was a lot of fighting and conflict and division. And that's important, I'll tell you in a moment. But if you look at the quote, it gives you a very clear sense of how Thomas Hobbes viewed human nature. And this is really important because it goes back to that idea of state of nature, right? What were things like when people are left to their own devices and there are no governing structures and no rules? And you can see his view was that man would resort, or if you will, devolve, and they would go to their most basic and raw and brutish selves, that they would be selfish, that they would try to game each other, that essentially they would not work in collaboration or cooperation with each other, that essentially things would devolve into chaos. And this was a really awful state of being. You'll notice that Hobbes is going to argue that essentially whenever you don't have rules, people would live like animals. And that's going to give you some insight as to maybe why he's going to articulate these next bullet points in just a moment. But before I go there, let me give you a clearer sense, or maybe a better context for why he may feel this way. So Hobbes lived in England, I said, during a rather tumultuous time. He actually lived during the English Civil War. And if you're familiar with civil wars, they're quite traumatic for a society. They literally have brother fighting against brother, or families fighting against, neighbors fighting against neighbors. And that really sort of has a psychological trauma for the whole society. And it does leave you with the impression that man is perhaps not okay to sort of just be left to their own devices. That in other words, when there isn't some sort of agreed upon ruler that everyone follows, that perhaps things get really, very, very, what would you say?
Just brutal.
Brutal,
and savage.
Yeah. Things devolve. I'm trying to simplify my language because sometimes I can use words that are not always clear. And if that happens, just look it up, right? You can always pause us and you can look these things up. So that's not going to be my catchphrase, is look it up. Nonetheless, what I want to mention is that Hobbes, on top of having lived during a civil war period in England, he also was on the losing side. He was a royalist. So he was in support of the king that was in power, and he ultimately had to flee to France. But I tell you all of this so that you get a better sense for why he characterizes the state of nature in these very negative and sort of harsh tones. So what is Hobbes going to say then needs to happen? He says, well, because of all this chaos, that humans would agree to leave the state of nature by entering into a social contract. You know, a lot of people have this idea, the state of nature, no rules. Wow, that sounds really cool, right? Pure freedom. And Hobbes says, not really. That when people don't have rules and there aren't any individuals or systems in place to enforce the rules, that things get really ugly, right? And so he says they're going to agree, people will willingly agree to leave this state of nature to enter into a contract, right? So you know that a contract usually requires one or more parties to agree to certain conditions. In this case, we're going to talk to you about those in more detail when we get to Locke, but suffice it to say that basically the people are going to agree to give up some of their pure freedom, right, their pure liberty, in exchange for the government or some structure to provide some protection for those rights. So what Hobbes, though, is going to suggest is that people would, in fact, be best served if they had an authoritarian ruler, an all-powerful authoritarian ruler. And again, that may seem counterintuitive, right, given what this social contract was. But he was convinced that after people had seen what took place, that they would definitely be on board with having an all-powerful, singular authoritarian ruler or a governing structure that had all power and ultimate authority. And he used the Leviathan, which is this biblical sea monster that was an all-powerful entity, and its tentacles, in other words, the government's tentacles, would be in all aspects of life in order to provide the necessary control to rein in, if you will, to prevent mankind from resorting to their most brutish behavior, right? So that, in other words, he said the only thing that's going to make mankind act right or act appropriately in society is the fear, right, that there are punishment and consequences, and there's someone powerful or something powerful enough to enforce that. And so, again, for Hobbes, the ideal form of government for him was an absolute monarchy, right? Now, that's a little bit different. We'll get to how we distinguish monarchies and dictatorships, but he thought that was good because kings or queens, monarchs that is, they ultimately still rule on behalf of their subjects. And that, of course, presumably they do. Obviously, some don't. Did you want to add anything? All right. So then we turn our attention to John Locke, right? And if you can look at his quote, this one's really important for understanding how he understands mankind. He believes they're all equal and independent, and no one ought to harm another in their fundamental rights, their natural rights. We're going to refer to them sometimes interchangeably. There are 4 different ways to refer to these rights, and those are inalienable, unalienable, natural, or fundamental. Any one of those qualifiers will accurately describe life, health, liberty, or possession. Okay? So when I say natural rights or fundamental rights or inalienable rights or unalienable, it's referring to that set right there in that quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or possession. Okay? So Locke argued that in a state of nature, all people are free, equal, and rational. He wasn't saying that we're all as tall or as fast or as strong as each other. What he was saying is that by virtue of being human beings, that we are all entitled to the same rights. The fact that we're a human being is what makes us equal, and as a human being, we're entitled to certain unalienable rights. Now, each individual, according to Locke, possesses these rights because they are also rational, right? Essentially, Locke views humankind as mankind as capable of reason. And in other words, that as long as you give proper guidance and you have a structure in place, you do not need to force or impose rules on them, that mankind would follow them. Of course, there are still structures in place to punish those who don't, but that you don't need to be so heavy-handed in making sure that mankind follows your rules and orders, that they would be rational or reasonable and follow those rules with some guidance. So in addition, you'll notice that the fundamental rights are mentioned there again. And he said, though, to secure these natural rights, he agrees with Hobbes. Hobbes and Locke actually agree on this point, and that is that mankind cannot survive or thrive in the state of nature, that there does need to be government. And he agrees that people will want to get out of that state of nature because, remember, if there are no rules in place, if there's no enforcement, and if, in other words, there's no police or anything like that that's there to protect the violation of your rights from someone else, or rather by someone else, then it's a free-for-all. In other words, you'll never really have your rights because you're always worrying and you're always under the threat of somebody coming around and taking them away from you, either by killing you or stealing from you. And again, there are no enforcement mechanisms to ensure public safety, then you have no recourse. In other words, there's nowhere for you to go. So he says people are going to leave the state of nature and they're going to agree to form a government and give up some of their rights in exchange for protections from the government. But that the government from that point doesn't just get to do whatever it wants, right? According to Hobbes, as long as the government protects you from dying, or just pure chaos, rather, then you just need to follow that government. That having government, even if it's an authoritarian government, is better than having no government. That's essentially what Hobbes is saying. Locke is saying, no. We're not okay with a government just giving us some protection and then we surrender all of our freedoms and rights. What's the point, right? He instead suggests that while it is true that you will surrender some of your rights, government still has an obligation to protect your unalienable rights. In other words, it still has to honor your life, right? It can't just, kill people senselessly. It has to recognize your liberty. They can't just throw you in jail or detain you without any reasons. And they have to allow you to pursue possessions. In other words, they have to allow you to benefit from the labor of your own work. That was really key for these merchant middle class the merchant middle class that was emerging in Europe, is that they really believed in the idea of mankind being able to educate themselves and better themselves and benefit from that work. And so this was really key. And the foremost responsibility of government, right, again, he says, is to protect these natural rights. And that if the government doesn't protect these natural rights, in other words, if the government fails to honor your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness or possessions, then you have the obligation, not just the right, but the obligation to overthrow that government if it fails to do so. So that's a really critical piece there, because Hobbes is probably not on board with that idea at all, right? So Hobbes just says, well, the government's giving you some level of protection, just be happy you're not in a state of chaos. Locke's saying, no, we have a right to demand a bit more from our government. Our government needs to not just needs to not just provide protection, they need to protect our unalienable rights, and if they fail to do so, we have the right to overthrow them. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I'm going to explain to you why Locke had a different view than Hobbes, really quick, right? So Locke also lived in England, but he lived in England during a different time. He lived in England during a time of the Glorious Revolution. In other words, this was a moment in English history where there was a peaceful transition of power. In other words, there were people who were wanting to overthrow the king at that time, and they successfully did so without a single drop of blood being shed. So John Locke lived in England during a period of time when there was a peaceful transition of power. I mean, of course, the king didn't want to leave, but no one died in the process of that transition. So for him, the possibility and the probability that there could be transitions of power without complete chaos and anarchy was a real one in which he lived, one in which he experienced and lived. So keep that in mind, and as a result, you can imagine John Locke's going to have a much more favorable impression of mankind because he witnessed and lived during a time like that. And I should say also the king and queen that succeeded this king that got thrown out had to agree to certain key limitations to their power. So John Locke also lived during a time period where monarchs had to respect and honor certain rights and privileges of the citizenry. So that was really important. And so Parliament, the representative body in England at this time, had more say. And so understand that Locke is going to have a very different background and experience than his fellow Englishman Hobbes, and that's going to help explain partly why they're going to have some different conclusions. So then we get to Montesquieu. Montesquieu is going to be pretty quick here, but he actually made a really I should say, a key discovery. For Montesquieu, what he realized is that government really has three main functions, okay? It's there to indeed execute the laws, it's there to make laws, and it's there to adjudicate the laws. So essentially, he realized that governmental power could be separated into three groups. Now, he believed it was important to actually separate those powers because what he realized was, and through his research of history, was that trying to vest someone, or in other words, give someone all of these powers of government was too much. In other words, too much power made almost certain that someone was going to become corrupted. Okay, so this is sort of like the Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, the ring had too much power, and that eventually it consumed the person who was having it, right? And it corrupted them and made them jealous and greedy and envious and power hungry. Well, the same realization, right, Montesquieu had, obviously, about what happened with government structures. He says, no matter what kind of government you ultimately implement, you gotta make sure to separate these powers. And that's going to lead to the branches of government. So I told you executing the laws is the executive branch, right? And I told you making the laws, that's the legislative branch, and adjudicating the laws, judging the laws, resolving conflicts between the laws, that's going to be the judiciary. And that's his key contribution to the, if you will, philosophical pursuit of trying to design the best government possible. And so that way the government would avoid placing too much power in any one person or group's hands. Anything else?
I would use an example, like let's say in our classrooms or as a teacher, I have a rule that you can't touch Mr. Phillipps' stuff on his desk, right? So I have this rule that I explain on the first day. If you touch my stuff, if you take a pencil without asking, you're going to get in trouble. Let's say you're going to get detention. And so I made that rule, but I'm also the enforcer of that rule, right? And so I get to decide who has broken that rule and also issue punishment. And so I also become the judge of who broke that rule. So let's say you were using a pencil one day in class, and I thought it looked very similar to a pencil that I was missing off of my desk. But you might claim, well, I bought this pencil, I know it, but I just happened to be maybe the same as the one you had. But if I got to sit in judgment of you, I made the rule, I'm enforcing the rule, if I got to judge you and determine whether you're guilty and give you detention, and you know that you're right, and even if it had the best intentions, even if I thought I was being fair, it still would seem very unfair to you. And over time, as one person has that much power, yes, it's going to be, if it's not corrupting, it's certainly going to be unjust. And that the people being ruled in that case, so the students, would feel like they don't have a fair system of judgment or government in that case.
So our final key philosopher that we're going to look at, political philosopher, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau came from from humble beginnings, in fact. And that probably is going to help explain why he's going to advocate for this key contribution, which is the notion that any government that is created, he urged and stressed, needed to incorporate as much direct democracy as possible. And I'm going to clean that up a little bit and explain to you what I mean. First and foremost, though, I want to stress to you that every one of these philosophers was a social contract theorist. Again, what that means is that people would willingly agree to surrender or give up some of their rights in exchange.
What I say, or one word, like, is their autonomy, like their decision making, their freedom. Not, remember, Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu, maybe not Hobbes, but they would say you give, some of your rights when it comes to decision making and your freedom to make choices for yourself, but not never your natural rights.
Right. And so you agree to surrender some of those, if you will, freedoms or liberty in sovereign decision-making power in exchange for the government providing protection for the rest of the rights that remain that you'll have, and so that you can more fully enjoy those. And so that's really important to remember about all four of these political philosophers. The other thing is that the governed agree to be ruled to protect their life, liberty, and happiness. We mentioned that. But I guess this is where I'm going to clean up that comment I made earlier, which was the notion of direct democracy and what that means. Direct democracy means that the people have a direct say in what's happening to them. For example, where we saw the first sort of beginnings of this kind of government was in Greece. And the Greek city-states were small enough where they allowed the citizens to pretty much vote on anything that was happening to them. So if you can think about it as like a town hall meeting, all right? And in the town hall meetings, that's where all the decisions would also ultimately be made in terms of what laws would be passed and what policies would be pursued. Obviously, it's difficult to implement direct democracy in a country as large as the United States or any country with a large population. So it wasn't logistically feasible. In other words, it really wasn't possible to implement direct democracy in the way the Greeks did on a smaller scale. And Rousseau recognized that. But he nonetheless stuck to this point, which is that the best person to make the best decision for you is you. And that no person who tries to, parade themselves around as an elite and someone who's more educated per se. And I want to caution, right? I mean, obviously he thought there's definitely a time and place for people with expertise. But in terms of like political decisions and lawmaking, he really believed it was important for there to be a component where the people had a direct voice in what was happening to them. And that you really couldn't ask someone to follow a law if they never had anywhere in the process an ability to have a say as to what that law would be. And so when you look here, right, people will be more likely to obey laws if they had a direct voice in creating those laws. So again, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's major contribution was the idea that everywhere possible you want to try to include elements of direct democracy, even if you can't have a pure direct democracy writ large. In other words, you can't run your entire government that way. You could at least incorporate elements of it in your government. So for example, in the United States, direct democracy, this principle of direct democracy can be seen in how we elect our members of the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, the members of the House, are elected every 2 years by the people. We go and we obviously vote for who that person is going to be, and then that person will then make decisions on behalf. But that's the indirect component whereby the if you will, whereby the representative will make a decision on behalf. But the act of actually voting in that representative, that being done by the people, that is us, that's direct, right? Now, some states have things called, initiatives, and there's these referendums. You may have heard them when it comes to taxes or the issues of gay marriage, and that's a more, I think, clear-cut example of direct democracy, but we don't have a national version of that. So it's on a state level, you will see more clear-cut examples of direct democracy than sometimes on a national level. And when I say initiative or referendum, the initiative or referendum, it basically will put an issue that's of importance. For example, raising taxes 2%, okay? If that's a referendum or initiative, it will be placed on the ballot for we the people to vote on. Okay? In Georgia, in fact, any increase in taxes is going to be placed on the ballot for we the people to vote on whether or not that is the right thing to do. That's an example of direct democracy, where we the people directly decide what becomes law.
Okay.
Anything else?
Okay, so now we're shifting gears to a bigger question. And sort of, but in a way, going back to our original question, which is, so why do we need government? And all of these philosophers, as we said, agreed that we do need government. Okay, so we're going to look at four main categories or sort of reasons why we need government. Some of you may be filling out your guided notes as you watch this, and so this would be your opportunity to fill these in. The first need, and these aren't in any particular order, but the first reason we would need government is to maintain order and resolve conflict. So this is sort of the function of keeping peace, keeping order within society, sort of what we'd say domestically inside the country. So state and local, looking at that level of law enforcement. So what we want you to do is try to think of some examples. So how does the government keep us safe and keep us from harming one another and help us to resolve our conflicts without violence? So again, just take a second, maybe think of some examples. So what we might want to start, so if you are again taking notes, you would write this in the example section as I go over some of these examples. The first one example could be just simply the lawmaking process, right? So the legislature would craft laws that people are expected to follow. So we have laws against murder and assault and theft and so forth, right? So just laws could be one example of how we try to maintain order, making laws. To follow up on that, we also have police forces, right? So we have police forces at the state and local level. We also have national law enforcement, but their job is to then enforce those laws or sort of make sure the laws are being followed and possibly end up arresting certain people who may be in violation of the law. Another example would be the fact that if you are arrested or are prosecuted for a crime, we have a system of courts, right? So the courts also serve not only to adjudicate criminal acts and determine guilt if someone's guilty, but also to resolve what we call civil conflicts. So when you have a conflict with your neighbor or someone else, or you feel like a company sold you something that wasn't safe or whatever, you could resolve that in the courts, right, rather than resort to violence. So we have a system of courts. We also have a system of prisons, right? And so for those who maybe are seen as being a danger to society, they would then be separated from society and put into prison. So all of those would be examples of maintaining order or resolving conflict. Our second need for government would be providing national security. So whereas the first one is more sort of an internal control, providing national security is more external, right? So sort of protecting the United States, protecting the people or whatever country this government, is in control of, protecting us from outside threats. So in the United States, this, again, think of some examples. How does the government protect us from sort of foreign or external threats? Well, probably the first example that comes to your mind would be the military, right? So all of the armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, etc. So we have the armed forces could be one example. We also have things like border patrol or border protection or airport security. Those could also be ways to sort of protect us from people trying to cross into our country who may want to do us harm. But it's not just about military, there's also a peaceful aspect to it, right? So a lot of the ways we provide national security is trying to maintain good, peaceful relationships with other countries. This would fall under the general category of diplomacy, what we call diplomacy, our foreign policy. So this might include things like making treaties with other countries. So these could be defense treaties or other types of agreements. We also have what we call embassies, right? So we send ambassadors to our embassies in foreign countries. So we have in most foreign countries in the world, we have a United States embassy. Our ambassador's job, and this is through what we call the State Department, the ambassador's job is to sort of be a representative of our government in that country. And therefore, if the country that we're talking about, whatever country we're in, their leaders have a problem with our country or have some issue, rather than resort to war or conflict, they would try to work it out through diplomatic channels and work it out peacefully. So whereas the first two examples are probably something you would see in just about every country, or every country tries to do this, every country's government, when we get to providing public services and providing for the public good, you start to see a lot more variation from country to country. In other words, most countries have a military, most countries have a police force. But when you get to public services, that really becomes more of a variation. Different countries provide different services. Some countries, I would say, their government provides more services than our government in the United States. And we're also talking about national, state, and local government can all provide these services. But our country's sort of probably in the middle. Some countries maybe provide fewer services. Some countries' governments provide more. So for us, what would be some examples of public services provided by the government? Well, if we look at the national government, we're probably thinking of big programs, things like if you guys have probably heard of, called Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. These are the big programs we call entitlement programs. But these would be things that the government provides, Social Security being sort of you pay into the system and you get those rewards later from people who are paying. But Social Security is sort of like a retirement plan, a retirement benefit plan. We have Medicare, which all seniors qualify for, which is a healthcare plan provided by the government where they help pay your healthcare costs. We also have Medicaid, which is a healthcare program for sort of lower income and disabled Americans. So those would be some examples of services provided by the national government. You also have things like welfare and food stamps, etc. But at the state level, probably the biggest thing, in addition to healthcare, is education, right? So public schools are a public service, right? So that's and of course, all of these things are essentially paid for through our tax dollars. But so you have public schools would be a good example. Also, just the fact that the government builds roads. So building roads could be a public service. Also, things like public libraries, parks. If you go to a Cobb County Park and enjoy the playground, or when you were younger, maybe some of you still do. But soccer fields and things like that. Okay, so those would be some good examples of public services. The last reason why we need or have government would be to help make economic decisions and regulate the economy. Okay, so in our country, we'll talk later in this unit about our economic system, but our government does involve itself fairly significantly in our economy. And so what would be some examples of this? Well, one example sort of falls under this category that would be called fiscal policy. You guys will learn a little bit more about this when you take econ, or if you've already taken econ. But fiscal policy is sort of decisions the government makes regarding taxing, spending, and borrowing. So just setting taxes, like if the government raises our income taxes or cuts our income taxes, either way, that's going to affect the economy and it's going to affect the people, right, and how much we have to pay. The government also decides how to spend this, trillions of dollars that they take in revenues every year. So that obviously, as by pumping money into the economy, can affect the economy. They also have what we call monetary policy. Monetary policy, the government helps regulate the currency and how much currency is in circulation. They can set sort of the prime rate, the borrowing rates that banks will use as a starting point, and things like that. We also have the government can negotiate trade agreements. So we just recently entered into, or we're in the process of entering into this USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, where we're going to have certain trade parameters that we follow between the three countries. So making trade agreements, they can also do things like set a minimum wage. Our minimum wage has been sort of stuck at $7.25 for some time. So that's one of the debates being had in this current presidential race. But so setting minimum wage and things like that. So those are some of the examples of how the government would make economic decisions. Well, let me just mention, so now we're sort of shifting gears. This doesn't flow particularly well, but we are supposed to discuss these two concepts. So now we're going to get into sort of the difference between a state and a nation.
So as Mr. Phillips just talked to you about some of the responsibilities that a government has, it's important to understand the larger structure within which governments work, right? And so what we're going to use from here on out is the term state to refer to a political community or a political system that is going to be occupying or that's contained within a defined territory and ruled by an organized sovereign government. And let me talk to you about what some of these terms mean, right? So the term defined territory should be quite clear to you. It means that there are clear borders, if you will, and in some cases the borders are clearer than others, because there are indeed places that are states where, for example, in the Middle East, where you have vast deserts, sometimes it's really hard to know where one territory begins and the other ends, right? And you're going to have that issue throughout the country, throughout the world. So I need you to also understand that these boundaries, when we're talking about them, are entirely political. In other words, it's not as if there is some line in the line in the sand that lets you know where Iraq is and where Iran, begins and starts, so on and so forth. But so this is a very political process. In fact, there are debates about what the map should look like even, right? And we'll learn later on that it's our president, the president of the United States is going to have the power to to communicate to the rest of the world who we recognize as an actual state and who we don't, and what territories that includes. So, but anyway, imagine this. I'm going to give you a simple formula to remember a state. But before I do, I'm going to explain to you that word sovereign. Sovereign means the ultimate authority. That, in other words, there's no other government or there's no other state that could come in and tell you how you should do things or check you on what you're doing. Okay? So that's really critical to understand whether or not there is, in fact, a state. And so oftentimes the definition of a state also includes whether or not other countries recognize you, okay? So external recognition or international recognition is also important to understand that, because there will be sometimes in our history, there will be territories that one group claims as theirs and another group also claims as theirs. And it's really up to each country to determine who they are going to interact with and who they believe is in power there. So this is a really key definition and understanding. But a state, essentially, here's the formula that I want to give you. Think population plus defined territory plus governing institutions, right, or government, plus sovereignty, meaning ultimate authority and power to have say over what happens to you, plus international recognition equals state. Okay? So, note some examples down here. Of course, you'll notice China, Spain, South Africa. Most of the places that you understand to be states are, in fact, recognized as states. But I want you to ponder this question. Why would New York, for example, not be considered a state under this definition? Take a moment. Think about it. Think if you can come up with a reason for why New York would not qualify as a state per the definition we just read, okay? So at this point, I hope that you've given some thought to it, but essentially one of the key reasons for why New York, right, would not be considered a state under this definition is because it doesn't have ultimate sovereignty. In other words, New York cannot just do whatever New York wants without it also being okay or allowed by the U.S. Constitution, the federal government. To make this example clearer, the Civil War, right, brought this kind of question into sharp relief. If you remember, the southern states who wanted to maintain the system of slavery had decided that they were going to just leave the Union. And ultimately, that was decided not to be okay or possible because they were part of the United States of America. And so that they could not resolve that question on their own. And so we fought a war, obviously, to resolve that issue. And so it's clear then that the states within the United States, they are not themselves sovereign. Okay?
Right.
So
I think, yeah, so they do have some autonomy under our
Right.
Constitution, since we have a federal system. It's not that the states don't have any power to make decisions for themselves, but they don't have the final say on everything.
Right.
So sovereignty would mean you don't answer to any higher authority.
Right.
So one example might be, let's say New York, and this could be any state, right? Georgia, South Carolina, etc. Let's say New York wanted to raise the voting age when people vote for their members of the House of Representatives or the president. They wanted to raise their voting age to 21. Well, they cannot do that because the U.S. Constitution, the 26th Amendment, says you must allow a citizen to vote at the age of 18. And so New York does not have that choice. They cannot make that change. Therefore, that shows the limitations on their decision-making power. So a nation, and again, the reason these can be confusing to people is because we sometimes use these terms interchangeably. Often, of course, we use state and country interchangeably, which is fine, except for it becomes confusing when the United States we use the term state for our regional governments, right? But a nation is something different. Although again, we sometimes use this in place of state or country. But a nation is a group of people united by bonds of race, language, custom, tradition, and sometimes religion. So when we get into the idea of what's the difference, really one of the big differences is, I always say, is a state is a sort of just a thing. It's a place on a map. You know, like Mr. Davila said, it's if you can carve out territory and get people to recognize it as legitimate, you've got, and you form a government, and at that point you pretty much would then have sovereignty. That you have some people there, that you've got yourself a state. But a nation is a group of people. So a state is sort of a place on a map in a way, whereas a nation is a group of people, right? And a state is sort of permanently located, whereas a nation can sort of move or sort of be a bit more amorphous. So
let me just add, though, when he says a group of people, what he's suggesting is this is a group of people who are who share a common bond, right?
Right.
So common cultural heritage.
Right.
I think it's helpful with nation to think of cultural groups, right? So that's another way to think about it. People who share similar language, customs, food, religion, so on. That can be a nation. But go on.
Right. So you have the French would be a nation of people, the French people. They share, by and large, you don't have to have complete, all these characteristics 100%, but for the most part, historically, I guess predominantly a white society, but you have language, of course, that's very common, regardless of your race or ethnicity. But you have the French would have the same language, speaking French, and a lot of the same customs. And Catholic religion has dominated France for many years. So that they would be a nation of people. They're bound by their culture. The Kurds are another nation of people. Palestinians, Russians as examples. Of course, you also have then the state of France, right? So if you have the state of France, the country of France, but you also have mostly, French people living there, that was what we would call a nation state. So when a nation and state coincide, that's the ideal situation, right? But you can have a multinational state. So you could have In many countries, in many states in Africa, for example, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, you have multinational states, and this goes back to like the European colonization of Africa. And when they drew the lines, it was really a land grab, and they just grabbed what they could. So they were sort of blending people together who did not share the same culture. And therefore, when European governments gave those countries their independence, they were left with this mixture of nations, mixture of cultures within one state. If you think about it, would you rather, what's a better recipe for stability and success as a nation, or as a country, as a state, is to have that nation state. You can have a multinational state, you could have a nation state. The best example of that probably where you have like almost 100% of the people of a state also are from the same nation. The example I usually use is Japan. Japan is a very homogeneous country. Almost, everyone in Japan is Japanese, and that might seem obvious, but that's not always the case. So like for instance in Russia, or almost in any country, you have significant groups of minorities, a nation of people who live within that state who aren't Russian. Anyway, but the point is, ideally you would have a nation state. You can also have a nation of people without a state. So you could have sort of a stateless nation. And that's a couple of the examples I purposely included. For instance, the Kurds are the largest nation of people in the world without their own state. This also can be a recipe for conflict and instability. The Kurds, if you drew a line around where primarily Kurdish populations live, you could make a country out of it, but you would find that it currently would cover the states of parts of Turkey and Syria, Jordan and Iraq. Syria and Iraq and Iran. So it covers this whole territory of Southwest Asia. And of course, none of those countries are willing to cede their territory to the Kurds. And so you've seen a lot of conflict recently, especially in Turkey and Syria, outright war between the Kurds and the governments of those countries. Anyway, so now the Palestinians, of course, again, they had their own state, but after a war with Israel, Israel has claimed that territory. And so the Palestinians, again, are a nation of people without their own state. They're located again across the lines of several countries. So now, an interesting question is, that I like to discuss with my students, which isn't ideal for a digital format, but is the United States a nation state? And or in other words, is there such a thing as being an American, American nation? And what we end up debating, when we debate this, is sort of the answer is, it's like, we don't know. I mean, so certainly, though, the United States is not going to be your textbook definition of a nation state. We can all agree on that. But if you looked at the characteristics, do we mostly have, and I just randomly I don't know if this is, factually based, but like I sort of say, well, let's just say, is 80% of the population, do they meet this characteristic? And then maybe we could start saying it's a nation. So like if we say race, certainly the answer would be no. We don't have, 80% of our country being the same race. Language, though, I think you could say yes. Like 80% of Americans, I think very close to 100% of American citizens would speak English, at least as one of their languages. Do we have similar customs and traditions? And again, I would argue yes and no. We do certainly share certain customs. People of all different backgrounds and origins would celebrate, for instance, Independence Day, 4th of July, go out and watch some fireworks,
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving, things like that. We also study and honor a lot of the same leaders in our history, from George Washington to Martin Luther King Jr., et cetera, that we study our presidents and things like that. And then when we get to religion, no, we can't say that's necessarily a common 80% mark or whatever you want to say. So again, what we end up saying is, but I also say, I think part of being a nation can be sort of the mindset.
Go ahead, continue.
So the United States, I think there is a sense of us being one people, which is really amazing when you think about it. And we of course, our country has had many problems, and I'm not trying to minimize that. We've had, we continue to struggle with issues of race and gender and sexual orientation, identity. But it is almost, if you told someone, hey, we've got this country, and 60% of the people come from various European countries who don't like each other traditionally, right? You have, let's say another close to 20% that come from sort of different Hispanic backgrounds, and then you have, or Latin American backgrounds. You also have, African Americans, etc. And we put all those people together, and the fact that we don't regularly have, open civil war is almost, sort of amazing if you compare it to other countries. But so
I think it's appropriate and accurate to say that it's an open question, and that different people can answer that question differently, and that it's not going to be something that's fixed. It's always in flux. In other words, it's a moving target. At some points in nations or states' histories, there's more homogenous populations there than at other times. France is definitely, in many countries in Europe and other places, are wrestling with that, the changing makeup of their communities. And that poses some stresses and strains, but it also lends a lot of strength, because through that diversity and through these different experiences, we've been able to share common, if you will, we should be able to share strengths and weaknesses and learn from each other. And that's been quite beneficial.
Now for something completely different.
Okay, so now, again, I told you this first unit doesn't necessarily have a lot of great flow to it, because in Unit 1, we're supposed to cover such a diverse area of different government terms and concepts. So we're sort of shifting gears now we're going to focus on two groups of three things. We're going to look at three types of government, as well as examples of those types of government. And then we're going to look at a sort of a different way of looking at three types of government, which I call systems of government.
The structures.
And so we're going to look at sort of, in the first category, who rules the country, who has the power to make decisions. And in the second grouping, we're going to look at how a country sort of structurally organizes itself. So again, the first key question would be, who holds the power? So I'll let Mr. Davila cover our first example, which will be autocracy.
Help! I'm being
So if you heard that little sound clip, it's the Monty Python clip that talks about, help, help, I'm being repressed. And typically under autocracies, people are not going to have as much say. In other words, there will be one ruler who primarily rules with absolute power and makes decisions on behalf of everyone else. And so we can...
I'm your king. Oh, I didn't vote for you.
So you can see one example are monarchs, right? Or a monarchy, where you have a king or a queen. And under this arrangement, right, you are going to be ruled by a monarch or an emperor for that matter. And it's key to understand that in a monarchy, that power is passed on by birthright. In other words, through hereditary rules. Sometimes some countries or states say it's only the firstborn son or male heir. Others don't have that qualification. And it's just the oldest or eldest sibling of the queen or king, and so on and so forth. But they can vary. What's a key to understand, though, is a monarchy is going to be distinguishable from other types of autocracies, because the power is going to be passed on by birth. And in the past, they've also claimed that God chose them. You can see the divine right. That is not stressed as much anymore, but I don't put it past a monarch to try and claim perhaps that they did, this is all for divine reasons for why I'm in power. But the key to understanding autocracy is ruled by one person, because I'm going to give you a little bit of a mnemonic device to remember these to help you later on. But
a lot of these come from Greek origin. So auto is like self or one. Kratia, it would be to rule. So like rule by one. Think of it that way. Or think of automobile. Think of one person can drive it, or it's auto.
Right.
It can self move if you just put it in drive.
Well, he took away the mnemonic device I was going to use.
Sorry, go ahead.
So you put it in automatic if you want to also add it that way. But that, in other words, only one person can be in the driver's seat. And that's the idea behind autocracy.
So we have a picture of the king of Saudi Arabia. Let me just say that monarchies, as Mr. Davila said at the very beginning, absolute monarchies or autocracies that are monarchies, used to be the most common form of government. Today, it's, I think, thankfully, much more rare. And so it's really hard to find examples. I don't want you to confuse this with, say, Queen Elizabeth of the United Kingdom. She is a monarch, but she's in a system of a constitutional monarchy or a representative government. She certainly is not an autocratic ruler. So let's just distinguish. Whereas the Saudi royal family certainly rules in an autocratic way, that the king and the royal family have tremendous, almost unlimited power.
That's right. So the next type of example of an autocracy is going to be a dictatorship. And following this slide, we're going to show you the differences side by side. But suffice it to say that in a dictatorship, the government, again, is controlled by one person, right? Because that's what an autocracy is ruled primarily by one person. And one of the distinguishing features of a dictatorship, though, is that it's typically a military leader, okay, or someone who's taken power by military force. And so you can see examples down here below of Hitler and Mussolini, obviously, during the 1930s and 1940s. And then you can see a more modern day example of Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And again, you can see them obviously either in military regalia or side by side with the military, because again, that is a primary feature of their power and in the way in which they rose to power. So in this side-by-side comparison, in this Venn diagram, you can see how they compare, in other words, the similarities and differences between monarchies and dictatorships. And so let's just go through them very quickly. You can see with monarchy, the monarch, the king or queen, typically assumes power through their birthright, right? Through hereditary manner. Whereas a dictatorship, they're typically assuming power through force, right? A coup d'etat is just a French word for blow to the state, that essentially there's been a forcible takeover, usually through military means, of governmental power. And then you can look to the next bullet point and you can see that a monarch typically is going to rule, or they say they do, they rule on behalf of the people or their subjects. And so monarchs can sometimes be very beloved by their people, so that essentially whatever decisions they're making, whatever actions they're taking, they are doing so on behalf of their subjects. Whereas in a dictatorship, they usually rule in their own self-interest. Sometimes they'll pretend that it's in the best interest of their people, but more often than not, they're perfectly comfortable ruling in a way that is clearly in their own self-interest. And they're typically feared by the people. Now, this last bullet point, you'll notice that monarchs portray themselves as head of state. And this is sort of a term that sometimes is hard for people to pin down. But let me explain it this way, that the head of state is sort of the figurehead, the symbolic representation of your country, the person who embodies the traits and characteristics of what it means to be British, for example. So that when you think of England, and I shouldn't say England, rather, when you think of the United Kingdom, when you think of Britain, then you're going to think of the Queen of England, maybe one of the first people you think of. And when you think of her, you're also thinking of certain traits and characteristics that go along with her, right? So you notice that you probably have heard oftentimes or seen on logos on shirts where it says keep calm and carry on, right? And so this is where we left off. Monarchy and dictatorship, we were doing a side-by-side comparison in this Venn diagram, and I have already mentioned the differences, as you can see, but some of the similarities include, of course, that you have one all-powerful ruler and that there is a lack of political and personal freedom in terms of people being able to more freely have power and or authority over how they organize their lives, or what kind of freedoms they're able to enjoy in the public at large.
Okay, our second type of government is oligarchy. Again, if you look at the root, oli is a word means few. So we have a small group of rulers, usually elites. So a small group of people in that society who would be in charge of running the government, in contrast to the autocracy where you have one primary ruler. Some examples would be a council of leaders, such as the Soviet Politburo they had back in the 1980s and so forth. So communist governments are sometimes set up like oligarchies. China traditionally, or in the last few decades. We'll get to this, or I'll go ahead and say it now, which is sometimes it's hard to distinguish between an autocracy and an oligarchy. In fact, your book sort of blends the two when it talks about a dictatorship as an oligarchy. I don't want to confuse you in that way, but it is true that as an observer, as a political scientist, as we look at these countries and governments, sometimes it's hard to say. You could argue that a country is an autocracy, whereas another person may say, well, no, I think it's more of an oligarchy. But like Mr. Davila said, in both cases, you're going to have a lack of political and social and personal freedom. So the one commonality is that people are not going to vote for the government, like we'll see with our third type of government. So one example would be a council of leaders. But you could argue China today is President Xi more like a dictator, or is he still sort of having to share power with other top leaders and so forth? You could have what we call a military junta, which is just a group of generals that would take over, as you see the example in, I believe this is from Myanmar, or what used to be called Burma. And you could also have sort of a government run by economic elites, a plutocracy. This is where you might see a lot of influence from corporate leaders or business interests. Or you could also have an aristocracy where you have sort of this wealthy elite nobles who ran a country and things like that. So, but the point is, in an oligarchy, it's just a small group of people who sort of work together to make decisions. But the people at large, right, just like in an autocracy, the average citizen has little to no say in the government's decisions.
So when we're looking at, of course, this final type of government, we are perhaps more familiar with it, but sometimes we may forget, precisely how it may apply to our own government. But to survive, democracies, demos, the people, government ruled by the people or their representatives. So oftentimes when we're talking about democracy, we'll talk about direct and indirect democracy, and we'll get to indirect democracy in a moment. But I already mentioned to you direct democracy. Can you remember which political philosopher was a major contributor to having this principle incorporated into our Constitution? Well, if you guess Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you're correct. So when the people run the government and make laws directly, right? So I told you examples of that would be like initiatives or referendums, when an issue is placed on the ballot for the people to vote for directly, right, as to what becomes law. Anything else?
Yeah, so I think we're looking at a question here. Would this work in the United States? So like Mr. Davila said, we have elements of direct democracy that are built into our system, but would it work to actually have the people in the United States run the government, or even if people were allowed to make sort of daily or weekly choices in voting on certain legislation or certain initiatives that the government puts forward to us, referendums, etc. And I think probably what we would come to the conclusion is that it would be very difficult to do that. Not only would it be very difficult, possibly we could maybe make it work logistically. Certainly that would have been virtually impossible back in the 18th century, but maybe we could make it work logistically. But even if we could, would we want this? And certainly the founders of our country would have had a definitive no, we do not want this, right? And so they didn't believe that the average person had the requisite knowledge and intellect or an experience to make these difficult decisions that are involved in governing. They were more of an elitist group of people, which will lead us to another question that we have when we get to our current system, representative democracy.
So under a representative democracy, aka indirect democracy, because in this situation what happens is while the people may vote for a representative, that portion may be direct, but the actual decision making as to what becomes law, that's left up to the representative. So people rule indirectly through the election of representatives who then make decisions on their behalf. And as you can see, another way to refer to representative democracies are republics. In fact, that's precisely what the United States is. And we are a representative democracy. We're certainly not a direct democracy, even though we have elements of it in our Constitution and in our structure. But we are it's much more accurate to say that we are a republic. And so I want you to keep that distinction in mind when we're discussing the United States government, because a lot of people labor under this misimpression that somehow we are a democracy, and we use that term in a way that we're not always very aware or fully appreciative of what that means.
So one thing I also want to distinguish is, where if we did have direct, or sometimes it's called pure democracy, where would that work best? And so what I think we would argue is that you can have a direct democracy that functions well, but that would be in a much more like a smaller setting. Mr. Davila mentioned the Greek city-states, but even smaller probably to be effective.
Like towns.
Yeah. So an example today might be if you live in a neighborhood, right, and you have your parents go to what's called a homeowners association meeting, and at that meeting, there still may be a board of leaders of that group. But at the homeowners meeting, every major decision is put to a direct vote of the people. That works when you have a neighborhood of 30 or 40 or 50 houses. But if you're talking about a country or even like the state of Georgia, we could see how that would become more and more difficult. So a representative democracy works much better. And even Rousseau would have agreed with this, that in a larger community or at the nation, state level, I guess the country level, it makes more sense to perhaps institute a representative democracy rather than a direct democracy.
But to be clear, Rousseau probably would have liked to have seen more direct democracy components incorporated into our system, such as maybe national referendums or initiatives, which currently do not exist.
Vote for Summer. Yeah, right, I'm not voting for her. Then who are you going to vote for? I'm voting for Pedro Sanchez. Who do you think?
So that's from a movie called Napoleon Dynamite, a classic if you haven't seen it. But here we're going to discuss another debate topic here. I'll let Mr. Davila handle.
So there was a very famous research paper released by Gillens and Page, two very highly respected political science professors, who argued that if you look at which groups of people in our society actually have the most influence over policy, or where you see an alignment between what laws were being passed and who was in support of those laws, they argued that the bulk of our policies align with what the economic elites and business interest groups wanted rather than the average citizen. And so I pose this question to you. Could the claim be made that the U.S. is an oligarchy? That in essence, who really drives laws or what laws are being voted on or actually I should say being passed is largely determined by economic elites. In other words, what the wealthy people or class wants in the country. And if you do an analysis of this, I think it can really sort of get, well, have you ask some really interesting questions about how governments should function and who they should respond to. Or is this a legacy of the founding fathers in that they had designed a very elitist government that in large part put the ultimate authority in the hands of the landowning elite, of which they made up a significant portion of that group. In other words, all the founding fathers were white male landowners. So is this a residual effect? Is this something that was almost by design, or or are there other reasons to explain why this is happening? But it is certainly something to contemplate.
Okay, so now we're looking at that sort of next grouping of the ways that governments are organized, and this one asks a different question. The first one is who holds the power, and we saw, just to review quickly, that we have autocracy, where one person primarily holds the governing decision-making power. You have an oligarchy, where a small group of elites has the decision-making power, and then you have democracy, where the people or their representatives hold the power. In this scenario, in this grouping, we're going to be looking at what I call systems of government, just to distinguish from types of government. And we're going to be looking at how power is distributed. And we're going to see that there are three systems of government, just like the three types. And we have our unitary system, our confederal system, and our federal system. And so what countries have to ask themselves is how to best organize their government. So structurally, this you can have various combinations. You could have a democracy. A lot of people think unitary. So unitary is where the central government holds the governing power. That is not to be confused with autocracy. Okay, so you could have, autocracy certainly almost always would be unitary. But not, it's one of those things where most autocracies or most all autocracies are unitary, but not all unitary governments are autocracies. So you could have a representative democracy set up as a unitary system. So there are different combinations that you could have. But so which works best for the people? Now in our world today, just like we said, well, I don't know if we mentioned this, but representative democracy is the most common type of government. Well, unitary system is the most common system of government. And so, again, this is just a personal choice of what works best for the country. But what we're really asking is who holds the decision-making power? Is it the central government primarily? Is it the state governments primarily, or regional governments? Or is it a sharing or division of power between the national or central government and the state or regional governments? And you can see the three options here, the arrows representing how power or authority, the direction of authority from which level to which level. So I don't know if you want to.
And let me just add to with the types of governments. It's democracies and frankly types of governments. I want you to think of it as a continuum. In other words, I want you to think of it as a spectrum. And it's not like you get one check mark versus another check mark, that you're only this and you're only that. Sometimes there are, in other words, some representative democracies are much more representative than others, meaning that there could be very autocratic elements in a representative democracy. For example, Russia would be a good example of that. So I want you to be careful. It's still important to understand these terms so that we have terms to describe what it is that we're witnessing or seeing in terms of a dynamic. But it's also important to understand that there are a variety of ways in which you can mix these ingredients together. As Mr. Phillips already noted, that while all autocracies are unitary governments pretty much, but not all unitary governments would be autocracies, because there are plenty of representative democracies that in fact have unitary systems. And we'll talk about that in the next slide.
So again, this is which level of government holds the primary decision-making power.
Sure. So the most commonly used system in the world, in fact, is a unitary system. Now, mind you, the United States is not one. We are a federal system. We'll get to that later. But under the unitary system, take the root word uni. You know what that prefix means, uni, one. And what that means is all the power in that government structure is concentrated in the one central government, okay? One central location and place, and the central government then distributes that power to the state and local governments as it sees fit, right? And so you can see the various examples, the United Kingdom, South Africa, and China. I'm going to flip back to the image in the prior slide. So again, as you're looking at this, remember unitary, you'll notice the central government, that is the all-powerful, if you will, entity within the government. And then the arrows signify the direction of governing authority. In other words, from where the power flows. And so the power is centralized in the central government, and it is then distributed, allocated by the central government to the state and local levels as it sees fit. Now, mind you, at any moment, the unitary government could decide to rescind that power. In other words, take it back. The state and local governing authorities or entities are completely at the mercy of the central government. So keep that in mind under this arrangement. And there are certain advantages to arranging things this way. Obviously, you can pass legislation more uniformly. In other words, everybody's doing the same thing. It's good in times of crises, especially as you can see with coronavirus, having a unified national response. The countries who've had that kind of structured government have been very good at responding. Those that have had more federalized systems have had more difficulty and challenges responding because there is not a consistency across the board in terms of how the country is approaching the particular epidemic or something to that effect. So just keep in mind there are advantages and disadvantages to each, and we'll talk about those somewhat, but I wanted you to see the structure.
Okay, the next system is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, where you have this system of government, the confederal system, or what we usually refer to as a confederation. These are very rare today, in fact, throughout history, but this may work well when you want a very loose alliance. So a confederal system is a system of government where independent regional governments vest limited power in one central government. So whereas in a unitary system, the power is going from the top down, in this system, all the power originates with the regional or state governments, and then they determine to grant some of that power upward to a central government. So another way of looking at it again is what it says here, is it's an alliance of independent, and we use that term sovereign states, right? So sovereign states that give up some of their sovereignty voluntarily to one central government because they want to work together and have some coordination. Now, the United States was originally a confederation, which we'll look at in Unit 2. We called our first constitution the Articles of Confederation, and we will realize that this didn't work very well for us, but it was a system that was set up so that each state, Georgia, North Carolina, New York, and Pennsylvania, could be independent and sovereign, but that they would cooperate on certain issues together and have, maybe a common military strategy in theory, or foreign policy, for example. A modern example of this is the European Union. And we see that also has, in a way it's been good that the European countries can work together and have a common currency and open, in one big trading bloc and work together on military and foreign policy issues. But at the same time, countries sometimes disagree with the decisions of the European government. And to the point where, of course, in the case of the United Kingdom, they're in the process of withdrawing from the European Union over some of these disagreements in what we call Brexit. So a confederal system, again, is good when multiple states want to work together, but only sort of a little bit, So It's not a strong alliance, but more of a loose alliance.
I think, and if I may, I think Mr. Phillips is being generous by saying that confederal systems has been rare throughout history. There's a reason why they've been so rare, is because they've been failures in terms of actually distributing the resources that are needed or necessary, at least within the nation-state context. They've been abysmal failures. But on a broader scale, like with the EU, they seem to be okay as long as there's some commonly shared values. But even in the EU, we're starting to see a lot of fracturing. And in the UK is just the, if you will, the tip of the iceberg. If you look at Eastern Europe, for example, and even Southern Europe, you're starting to see great divisions. Now, of course, they're going to great lengths to try to get some level of consensus. But that's a very, very tenuous relationship. And while it's true that they were able to work together for a considerable period of time and have achieved peace over that time, which is really key to their growth and prosperity, they are experiencing the pains that many other nation states that have tried to implement this system have experienced. And the issue of sovereignty will come up over and over again. And it's a very difficult arrangement to keep in place for long periods of time. I think for shorter periods of time with a focused goal, they work. And again, that's not an indictment on the European Union. I mean, in fact, I think they accomplished some great things, as you just said. But I do believe it is indeed a criticism of this system and arrangement. So I sometimes tell my students, think about these three systems like the porridges that Goldilocks, right, drank. So the unitary maybe is too hot, the confederal is too cold, and the federal, is just right. Of course, that reflects a bias. So sometimes I sort of steered clear of that analogy, because I don't want to give you the impression that any one of these systems is just clearly better than the others. I do think that I'm safe in saying that confederal is not one of the most workable, and that's, I think, a shared opinion, since you can look throughout history and see where we are. But the federal system, you have a system of government in which power is shared or divided between the central government and the regional governments. And so, as Mr. Phillips mentioned, while we had started off as a confederation, and that was a failure, what resulted from that was a compromise between those who wanted to continue being a confederation and those who wanted a much stronger role for the central government. And this was sort of the result, was this federal system, this hybrid, if you will. So in this arrangement, right, you often have, a relationship between the local and regional governments and the central governments that is evolving over time. It doesn't stay fixed. Sometimes the central government is playing a more minor role, where the states play a larger role in determining their own decisions, like the beginning of our U.S. history. That's the case. The U.S. states experienced much more power. But as time went on, and as our problems became national or international in scope, then the role of the federal government you started to see rose, and it would become more prominent. And today, it's very safe to say that the federal government is the more powerful of the entities right now. Now, again, it's not a fixed thing, and in other words, it could change. It can ebb and flow. It can, evolve. But I want to stress to you some examples. Of course, the one that we want you to be most familiar with is the fact that the United States is a federal system. And if you recall from the prior slides, we are a federal republic, right? So Canada, India, and Brazil are some other examples. Notice that all of those states, all of the nation states, I should say, that we just mentioned there, are either very large in land size or very large in population size, and in these cases, both are true, right? So all of these states, Canada's population probably not up there as much as the others, but nonetheless, it's still when compared to other countries. So these states is very interesting. So for nation states that are large in size and have diverse groups within them, and large in population. The federal system seems to be a good option at times, although China would disagree, right? There are others who have certainly disagreed. Russia would disagree, perhaps. They have a unitary system. So it's an ongoing discussion and conversation, and I guess I don't want to just point out those examples because there are other states that are not either communist or authoritarian, but nonetheless, it's an ongoing conversation. But I want to leave you with this, since we're going to finish up the systems, right? One, all-powerful central government. Confederation, I would say sometimes to my students, think of confetti, right? Confetti are these pieces of paper that are all spread out, right? They're still in a sort of general area, but they're disjointed to some extent and loosely connected and associated. And then federal, fair share. Federal, fair share. Play off alliteration a little bit. So one, all-powerful central government, and then confederation, right, confetti, spread out, all disjointed, right, but in a general sort of area for a loose purpose. And then federal, fair share, where we see the central government and the local governments sharing power with one another.
And just one other thing, in a unitary system, as Mr. Davila said, the central government can grant or take away powers from the regional governments as much as they want to, as they see fit. In a federal system, each level exists independently. In our country, for example, the United States government cannot just cannot just destroy a state government or dissolve a state government and say you guys no longer exist.
Right.
So they do, and that's another difference.
So just to drive home that point, for example, unitary government, if we had unitary, the U.S. government could say, hey, Georgia, we no longer like you, bye, and we would be out. That's it.
In fact, our states are set up as unitary systems within the state. So that we've seen that come into play with the recent debate over mask mandate in Georgia, which, by the way, the reason we're not wearing masks is because we're in each other's COVID circles. So
yes, we are.
But normally
we
would say to you, if you're this close to someone for this long, you should definitely be wearing a mask.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so in Georgia we have the governor and the local, then a lot of the regional leaders, like city leaders, mayors, arguing over who has the authority to issue a mask mandate.
Right.
So let me just say, so this one, again, just sort of goes back to the same point we've made, but we said that the ones that are most distinguishable are the confederal system and the unitary system. And again, just to reiterate that point, in a unitary system, all authority starts at the top and goes downward as the central government sees fit. In a confederal system, all the power starts at the lower and regional level and then is granted upward as they see fit. And then federal would go both directions. So we're going to now look at two types of representative democracy. So breaking down representative democracies even further, the reality is there's actually hybrids and combinations of these things, but we're going to try to somewhat distinguish between two types of representative democracy, and we'll see that those are, on one hand, parliamentary systems, and on the other hand, presidential systems. Kind of gave it away, but here you go. So here we go. All right, so I'm going to let Mr. Davila, since he's more of a comparative government expert, look at the parliamentary system versus presidential system.
I'm not going to get into many of the nuances here. I'm going to sort of stick to the script because we want to wrap this up. But nonetheless, you should understand there are two main types of representative democracies, and that is parliamentary systems versus presidential systems. In parliamentary systems, one of the key features is that you should understand that the legislative branch and the executive branch are fused, meaning that the people who are going to populate the executive branch come directly from the legislative branch. Okay, so in the case of the UK, for example, the Prime Minister is selected from the members of Parliament. And so the Prime Minister is, in fact, a member of Parliament, as are the cabinet officials. So all the members, the key members in the executive, are also members of the legislative branch. So also you should know under a parliamentary system that voting can take place at any time Whenever the prime minister loses the confidence, it's called a no confidence vote of his party. So at that point, then an election will be called in consultation, usually with the head of state, which is usually a monarch, not always. Sometimes it's a president. But under the parliamentary system, they usually distinguish between the head of state and head of government. And just to be clear, we mentioned head of state before, a ceremonial figurehead. They do sort of the international shaking of hands, and they're the embodiment of that country's, character, like the Queen of England. And then the Prime Minister, the HOG, the head of government, that's where the real work gets done. That's who's making policy, passing policy, and so on and so forth. With the presidential system, those branches, the legislative and executive, are actually separate. So, for example, in our country, right, the president is not, a member of the Congress, right? And vice versa. No member of Congress is the president. So these are separated in line with which political philosopher? Oh yeah, that's Montesquieu, right? So just remember back to our political philosophers and why things are arranged the way they are. Now, with the presidential system, the other thing you should know, right, is that the cabinet members are also not members of Congress. And then finally, that when you're voting for the president and Congress, these things take place, or these elections take place at regular intervals, okay? So these are some key distinguishing features. There's some pros and cons, right, to each. Obviously, parliamentary systems, just like unitary systems, they're going to get legislation passed on a much quicker basis. So they may be able to respond to crises more quickly and uniformly. But on the other hand, of course, the presidential system allows for a variety of approaches to perhaps problems and driving at consensus. In other words, trying to incorporate as many different views and sort of arriving at a middle or moderate place in terms of what the outcomes are. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen perfectly, but that's one of, say, the advantages that one could have under a presidential system, say, versus a parliamentary system.
So just quickly to point out, so for instance, in, say, the United Kingdom, well, we're going to talk about this on the next slide, but basically, the prime minister, as Mr. Davila said, would have been an elected member of parliament. But not only is the president, it says the president is not a member of Congress, they cannot be. And so, for instance, when Barack Obama became president, he was a senator. He had to resign his position in the Senate before he could take the oath of office as president. Likewise, one of his top cabinet officials, Hillary Clinton, was a senator from New York. She also had to resign her position as senator before she could accept and be sworn in as Secretary of State in the cabinet.
I think that this just is a diagram, right? That sort of makes it more clear how these systems operate. And I want you to think in the back of your mind what the pros and cons may be of each system, because they present different challenges and they present different strengths as well. And I've mentioned some. But look at this and you can get a sense for the role of the citizen. Remember I told you what one of the key questions at the very beginning the political philosophers had to answer was what is the proper relationship between the people and their government, right? And this gives you a sense for how different countries answer that question.
Right, so just if you guys can see this, but so in a parliamentary system, this is an important, distinguishing factor. The people elect we're saying parliament. Different countries would use different terms,
sure.
But the citizens would elect the legislature, and then the legislature would choose the executive. Usually, whichever party has a majority, or maybe a coalition government, but they choose from amongst their ranks who they want to help carry out the laws. And we call it, again, prime minister. Different countries may use different terms. I think mostly prime minister. But yeah, so you have the legislature choosing the executive leader. In a presidential system, the citizens elect the president, and then they separately vote on who they want for the legislature. Now, in our system, this is actually not true. We don't elect the president directly. We have this bizarre system, which we'll talk about later in the semester, called the Electoral College. But in every other presidential system, the people actually elect the president directly, and they elect their legislators directly, but it's two separate choices. That in our system, what that means is we would have possibly a Republican president, but a democratically controlled legislature by party. So that's another sort of difference or change, could be a drawback or a positive, depending on how you look at it.
More diverse views. Thank you for listening to our PowerPoint narration. We appreciate it, and we will obviously be in touch with you guys throughout the semester. And we have other videos as well, which you'll happily view. Feel free to put us on 2x speed or whatever speed you need. But we appreciate it.
And again, if you have any questions, so if you have questions regarding this, feel free to contact us.
Either one of us.
Email, and we can help you out. Wait, did I do that right?
I guess. We're going to look.
Oops.
Go to...
Wait.